The message from evolutionary psychology has been not only that men are naturally promiscuous, but they're naturally flesh-obsessed pigs who are irresponsible, crime-prone. We really need to counter the notion that men are just naturally, beasts at heart, and come back to a vision of men made in God's image who are naturally oriented towards marriage and family and fatherhood.
Is masculinity toxic? Are women usually the victims and men usually the villains? You're going to hear sometimes these sorts of scripts or narratives in popular culture today. But a new book by professor and best-selling author Nancy Pearcey is shattering some of the misconceptions about masculinity. I'm really excited to have on the podcast today Professor Pearcey, who I'm a big fan of, and to talk about her new book called The Toxic War on Masculinity: How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes. Our sponsor today is 7 Weeks Coffee. 7 Weeks Coffee is not just delicious gourmet organic coffee. It's what I drink every morning, but it's also the company that's fueling the pro-life movement. They give 10% of all of their money directly to the pro-life movement, to pro-life pregnancy centers. They've given over $150,000 today. So every time you drink 7 Weeks Coffee, you're not just enjoying a delicious cup of coffee, but you're also fueling the pro-life movement. Order your first batch or become a regular member of 7 Weeks Coffee with me at 7weekscoffee.com. and use code Lila10 for 10% off your first order. Public Square is the new Yelp for businesses that actually support your values. Why support and patronize businesses that are pro-abortion, pro-gender ideology, pro the things that are destroying the American family? Instead, using Public Square, download the free app today, Public Square, you can find a listing of over 50,000 businesses that support your values. Let's build a movement in this country to support the companies that are helping build the country instead of patronizing companies that hate what you believe in. Download the free Public Square app today and be a patron of the 50,000 businesses that are fighting for your values. Click the link in the description to download the free Public Square app today. Thanks so much, Nancy, for joining the podcast.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So first of all, you've written wrote the book Love Thy Body, you've written other books, you're a professor, you study, a lot of your study is of Christianity, masculinity, femininity. What inspired this book, The Toxic War on Masculinity?
Well, my eye was caught, first of all, by the incredible hostility that has become socially acceptable to express toward men. For example, there was an article in the Washington Post that was titled, "Why Can't We Hate Men?" And I thought, really? In a mainstream publication? A Huffington Post editor tweeted, #KillAllMen. You can buy t-shirts that say "so many men, so little ammunition." And books have come out with titles like "I Hate Men" and "No Good Men" and "Are Men Necessary?" And even men have jumped on the bandwagon. There was a book written by a male author, and the main sentence that's been quoted from that book is, "Talking about healthy masculinity is like talking about healthy cancer." And you may have seen this. It was in the news just a few weeks ago. The director of the movie Avatar, James Cameron, said testosterone is a toxin that you have to work out of your system. So no wonder a survey found recently that almost half of American men, 46%, say these days society seems to punish men just for acting like men. And by the way, that one's in the book, but there was a more recent one in Britain, 55% of men. So the number's going up. And whether you agree with that or not, that is a lot of men who now think that they're getting a bad deal in modern society. And so I wanted to get to the bottom of this. You cannot really oppose the social trend unless you know where it came from and how it developed. And that was my goal in The Toxic War on Masculinity, is to help people understand where it came from so that they can respond more effectively.
So you do an amazing job in the book of sketching the history, a sort of history of masculinity and how different cultures and, especially the Western culture has viewed masculinity and kind of debunking some stereotypes. Tell us what your research found as you looked back at the history of masculinity.
Yeah, this was interesting because I think most people think the concept of toxic masculinity arose, say, in the 1960s with second-wave feminism. Actually, it has much deeper roots. And that's what we need to understand. You have to go all the way back to the Industrial Revolution. Before that time, men worked with their wives and children all day on the family farm, the family business, the family industry. And so the ethos for masculinity really focused on their caretaking role. You had to be gentle and patient because you're working with your wife and kids all day. Even the concept of authority had a very specific meaning then. It didn't mean you get to do whatever you want. It meant you had responsibility for the common good. The idea being, you look out for what's good for you, I look out for what's good for me. But who looks out for the common good? Whether it's the marriage, the family, the church, school, civil society, whatnot. And the favored word of the day was, the person in authority was to be disinterested, which means he was not supposed to look out for his own interest. He was supposed to look out for the good of the whole. So how did we lose this? The Industrial Revolution took work out of the home. And of course, men had to follow their work out of the home into factories and offices. And for the first time in American history, men were not working with people they loved and had a moral bond with. Instead, they were working as individuals with other men. And this is when you start to see the language change. Already in the 19th century, you see in the literature of the day, people began to protest that men were losing that caretaking ethos that they'd had in the colonial era, that men were becoming individualistic, self-interested, egocentric, look out for number one, get ahead at all costs, greedy and acquisitive, to use the language of the day. And so already back then, for the first time, you start to see the male character described in negative terms. People didn't like it, but they did say that our men are changing and they are no longer following, well, either the colonial ethic or the Christian ethic too, because this was when secularization really permeated American culture. As large public institutions emerged, businesses, factories, financial institutions, universities, banks, and so on, these people began to say that these large public institutions should operate by scientific principles, by which they meant value-free. In other words, don't bring your private values into the public arena, which is what we still hear today. And since men were the ones getting that secular education and working in that secularized workplace, they became secular earlier than women did. And you see that in the literature of the day, too. People began to complain that men were not going to church as often. They were not governing their behavior by biblical ethics. They were losing a biblical sense of manhood. And so there were the two factors, the economic factor, but also it became the catalyst for secularization.
So along this same time as men are kind of leaving that family farm and the tenderness and the sort of cooperative nature of that family business, right? They needed more maybe tenderness or gentleness, like you said. How is this affecting femininity or the experience of femininity for most women? Because if the men are leaving and going into the factories and into the office, how does this impact women and their living out their feminine role?
Yes, good question. Because if values were kicked out of the public arena, where would they be cultivated? In the private arena, in the home and church. And who presided over the home? The woman. And so for the first time ever in human history, women were said to be morally and spiritually superior to men. They were set up as the...
I want to pause for a sec because that statement is such a tremendous one. And when I was reading your book, I thought most people do not know this history, but this, what you just said, that for the first time women were seen to be morally and spiritually superior. I think today, even among many Christians, Catholics, this idea that, women are, the level of womanhood is the measure of civilization. That's Archbishop Fulton Sheen. So it's a Catholic, idea in Catholic world as well as in the evangelical world. Women are supposed to have these, are especially spiritual. They're usually more spiritual than men. But are you saying that that is actually more of a modern idea?
Very much, very much. So all the way back to the ancient Greeks and Romans, people had thought that men were morally superior, stronger. The idea was that they saw the insight into right and wrong as a rational insight, and they thought that men were more rational, and therefore men were more virtuous. In fact, the word virtue comes from the Latin vir, means man, as in the word virile. So the very word virtue had overtones of masculine strength and honor. And so it was completely new in the 19th century when people began to turn to women and say, well, men are sort of losing their biblical moorings, their ethical moorings. So women, it's up to you now to be the moral guardians of society. And that had that had negative consequences because, first of all, it created tension, obviously, between men and women. I mean, who wants his wife to be his moral overseer? But it also let men off the hook because essentially they said, well, men are not naturally oriented toward marriage and family. Men are not naturally virtuous. They're naturally more prone to sin and vice and temptation, sexual temptation in particular. So it was, and I think what you're saying is very good. I did an interview with a young Christian couple not long ago. So I turned around and interviewed them. And I asked them, what do you think among young people today in the church? Is this double standard still there? And they said, oh, absolutely. It's just thought that boys and men, dating, they were a young married couple, but dating and married couples, that the man is more prone to pornography and sexual sin in particular, and that it's up to the woman to hold the line. It's up to the woman to hold the man in check. So, as you were saying, I think that double standard is still there in the church, and it does two things. It puts way too much pressure on women, but it lets men off the hook. And so I think that we need to call men back to a moral standard rooted in Scripture and persuade them that, in fact, this is their true nature. If we say that their true nature is not to be oriented toward marriage and family, well, then marriage and family seems to be an imposition, imposed by women, and contrary to their true character. And so I think that's a very dangerous point of view. And you're absolutely right. I think since the 19th century, it still exists today, that same double standard.
So it seems like part of your argument is that today's modern world, the office and, the urbanization of family life and, we don't have the factory as much anymore, but I guess there's like a little bit of a factory sense of just sitting at one's laptop all day like a machine typing away. So that this has brought out, you could argue, the worst in men, or it's not been healthy for men, and especially in terms of family dynamics. Do you think that is the case today? I mean, I know maybe it was more severe when men had to leave the home for 12 to 16 hours to go into a factory or even live at the factory away from their family. But is today's modern society really not set up for helping the masculine strengths, the good things about masculinity flourish, and instead draw out the vices? That seems to be part of the argument that you're making in the book.
Well, look at how fathers are treated in the media. Fathers are ridiculed, mocked, made fun of. The dimwit dad, the doofus dad, it populates all of our advertisements and movies and animations from Homer Simpson on. Where did that come from? We know, most of us know that's the case, but where did it come from? Again, if you go back to the Industrial Revolution, when fathers were taken out of the home, for the first time, they really were not deeply integrated into the family dynamics anymore. They didn't really know what the children were doing throughout the day. They were no longer sort of closely connected to their children's experiences and feelings. And already in the 19th century, you see people protesting. Again, first of all, they protested that, here's how one columnist put it at the time, the father, who is meant to be the prototype of the Heavenly Father, is not here all week. He's only here on Sundays. So people were in shock at the time, right? We're used to it now, but at the time they were really shocked by the change in the family dynamics. But you also see in the literature of the time people beginning to say, well, I guess the fathers are basically irrelevant, insignificant, disconnected, and even incompetent. The doofus dad already shows up in the 19th century. People began to say, well, fathers really don't know much about what's going on in the family, so, they don't have much to say. So if you want to reconnect men to their children, well, this does give us a clue to how to do it. I have a whole chapter on, can we flex the workplace a little, even after the Industrial Revolution, to help fathers be more in touch with their children. And the pandemic had a very minor silver lining, which is that a lot of fathers said, hey, we actually enjoy being home. One survey found that 65% of fathers said they did not want to go back to the office full time, that they preferred to work at least part-time from home. And the New York Times had a really fun article. The title was something like, during the pandemic, fathers got reconnected to their families, and they don't want to lose that. So it does also give us some direction on perhaps practical things that we can do to reconnect fathers to their children. And that is, after all, the long-term answer to toxic behavior in men is fathers raising their kids in a healthy, biblical sense of masculinity. One psychologist put it this way: we're not going to have a better class of men until we have a better class of fathers, fathers who don't run out on the job.
So, there's obviously the trope about toxic masculinity, which can be real, very harsh, angry, lustful, domineering masculinity, right? But then I think someone in the maybe very conservative space, or maybe hyper-traditionalists, I'll call them, sort of fundamentalist traditionalists, would say, well, they don't agree with toxic masculinity, but they say that, men shouldn't be changing diapers. Men should be out there providing and leave the entire household to the wife, and she should be, have dominion over the household entirely, and his job is to bring in the money, basically, and the more feminine tasks of caretaking of children, especially very young children, is, not masculine. These seem to me to be two bad extremes. But what's your take on that?
Yeah, I agree with you. By the way, Martin Luther had a wonderful quote that I ended up cutting from the book for space. But Martin Luther has a wonderful quote where he says, if a father is washing his child's diapers or doing some other mean task, that's how he put it, some other mean task for his child, and he is ridiculed as an effeminate fool, his own words, that God with all his angels was looking down and smiling. So Martin Luther himself was very involved in washing diapers and doing mean tasks for his children. But so were the colonial fathers. Colonial fathers were expected to be just as involved with their children as mothers were. And in fact, they were. They were, of course, mothers have a special role when they have infants, when they're nursing and so on. But it was expected that fathers would take the lead when it came to the spiritual and intellectual training of their children. And most books on parenting in the colonial era were written to fathers. Today, if you go in a typical bookstore, books on parenting are usually, most of them are for women, for the mothers. But back then, whether it's sermon, pamphlets, advice manuals, and so on, addressed the father, because the father was seen to be just as deeply involved with his children as mothers. In fact, there's a word for it. They were called house fathers. Today we talk about housewives. That was actually a common word back then, house fathers. So fathers were expected to lead the whole family in terms of family prayers, for example. So I think we've kind of lost touch with the colonial fathers when we today say, well, men should not be involved. We've lost touch with, most of human history, because pre-industrial era is most of human history. The industrial world has been around since the 18th, 19th century. And also, I would say this, too. The idea that men find their true nature outside the home was also a late 19th century trope. What happened is, after the Industrial Revolution, when men were no longer being raised on the farm, and young men were no longer hardy, strong, farm boys, people began to say, men are getting soft. They're working at a desk all day. They're losing their masculinity. And there was actually a word that entered the English vocabulary, over-civilized. The fear was that men and boys were becoming over-civilized. And that's when we see the beginning of the notion that, to find your true masculinity, you've got to get away from the home, away from family, away from women in particular. And this is when, for example, in the literature of the day, Westerns became very common. And other literature that said the way to find your true masculinity is get out with the cowboys and rope cattle and sleep under the stars. And some of that literature is fun. I like Westerns as much as anybody. But the underlying message was, again, that marriage and family are not true to the male nature. And to find his true self, he gets out mountain climbing and hunting and soldiering and sailoring. And that was a big part of the literature of the 19th century. And I'm concerned that today we're sort of just taking that literature and baptizing it again, instead of really thinking ourselves what is a true definition of masculinity.
Well, it's interesting because I think for people that have experienced it, they know it. If they had a father who was that house father, I mean, they were providing, but they were very much engaged in the home emotionally, physically. It's easy for them to laugh off extreme versions of masculinity bubbling up in culture. But for the many people today didn't have that for whatever reason, and that's where I think it's easy for them to fall into these extremes or to think that the extreme is correct. Another popular lie that I hear, Nancy, is that, and I believe it's a lie, is that men are not prone to monogamy, that, women are prone to monogamy because they can carry a child. And so they, having multiple sexual partners isn't as, I guess, helpful for them. But evolutionarily speaking, men are not prone to monogamy because they have this desire to impregnate as many women as physically possible and, have, thousands of offspring, biologically speaking. I don't buy that. I can give my take on it, but I really want to hear yours, why that actually isn't true about men. And it is a lie that men can't be happily monogamous.
Well, yes. Let me give the bigger picture of the whole impact of evolution on concepts of masculinity. It starts with Darwin, obviously. So Darwinian thinkers began to say that the men who came out on top in the struggle for survival would by necessity be men who were rugged, ruthless, brutal, savage, barbarian, and even predatory. And this is the language that evolution sort of inserted into our vocabulary, that to find your true self was to get in touch with the beast within. Instead of living up to the image of God in yourself, live down to the beast within. So this is, for example, when the Tarzan books became popular. And the son of the author actually writes that his father wrote the Tarzan books to communicate a Darwinian worldview, that we're just, human beings are just part of nature, products of natural selection. And so so Tarzan retains his inner wildness because he's been raised by the apes. And even though he learns European customs and languages, he still, at the end of the book, turns to Jane and says, "I'm still a wild beast at heart." And so, and by the way, there was also a much more serious literature also called, it was a genre called literary naturalism, which was also explicitly designed to use fiction to teach a Darwinian worldview. The best known being Jack London, who wrote about dogs. But of course, it was a metaphor for humans because his message was that humans are just products of genes and environment, natural selection. When he was a young man, London read books about Darwinism and experienced what one historian calls a religious conversion to radical materialism or naturalism. So that was in Darwin's day. It was called social Darwinism, but it's come back in our own day under the title of evolutionary psychology. The idea being, if your body has evolved, so has your whole psychology, your whole way of thinking. And these are the people who have popularized the idea that from an evolutionary perspective, a man should spread his seed as wide and far as possible to get as many of his genes into the next generation. Of course, that doesn't even make sense biologically, because
why?
Human infants are so fragile and needs long-term care that if a man quickly moves on to his next sexual conquest, that infant is much less likely to survive and he won't get his genes into the next generation. So even from a scientific perspective, not even a moral one, it doesn't even make sense. But evolutionary psychology has popularized the idea that men, well, I'll give you another example. It was a best-selling book, called The Moral Animal. And the author says, the human male is a possessive, flesh-obsessed pig. Giving a man a book on how to have a good marriage is like giving a booklet to Vikings on how not to pillage. So the message from evolutionary psychology has been not only that men are naturally promiscuous, but they're naturally flesh-obsessed pigs who are irresponsible, crime-prone. George Gilder has a book called Men and Marriage, in which he says a man's deepest impulse is to get on the road, get his motorbike out on the road and, again, get away from civilization, get away from women. But then he turns around and says, and women need to tame these men. It's up to women to civilize them. Like, what, really? First of all, men are a lot stronger than women. If they really are so prone to sin and vice and crime, what woman is going to be able to tame them, and what woman would want to? So I think we really need to counter the notion that men are just naturally, beasts at heart, and come back to a vision of men made in God's image who are naturally oriented towards marriage and family and fatherhood.
Do you buy the analysis today? It's a more modern analysis that men are naturally more promiscuous. Now, I think it is a fact that, men, due to their size and their strength, typically are the aggressive party when it comes to sexual violence. I think that literature is clear, that research is clear. But I have one thing that I saw in your book a few times. It wasn't a huge focus of the book, but was a little bit of debunking of the idea that women are more sexually virtuous by nature. It's easier for women to choose sexual virtue, self-control, than it is men.
I wouldn't deny that the sexes maybe have somewhat different strengths and weaknesses. So I don't have a problem with saying that there may be some things that men are more prone to versus women. But the very notion that men are more promiscuous does come from those evolutionary assumptions. And like I said, it doesn't even make sense scientifically, let alone morally. So what I do in the book several times is I come back to what's called the cultural mandate. And half my students have not heard that term. So the cultural mandate is in Genesis 1, where God has created the physical universe, he's created the animals, and then he creates the first human couple. And what's the first thing he says to them? He tells them why he created them. What's their purpose? What's their job description? And he says, be fruitful and multiply and subdue the earth. And in the highly streamlined language of Genesis 1, we can unpack several levels of meaning there. So be fruitful and multiply, starts with the family, but historically, all of the other social institutions do grow out of the family. So it also means, the extended family, the clan, the tribe, the village, the nation. And social institutions are started for certain functions, you need a state, you need a marketplace, you need a church, you need a school. And so the phrase in Genesis actually means build up all of the social institutions, build the entire social world. Subdue the earth means harness the natural resources. So most civilizations start with agriculture, but then mining, technology, invent computers, compose music. One of my students once asked me, compose music, really? I said, I play the violin. So I said, well, what's the violin made out of? Wood. What's the bow made out of? Horsehair. So all of the transcendent beauty that we associate with music starts with harnessing the raw materials of nature. So I bring men back to the cultural mandate in particular, to counter the notion that men are naturally, like you said, promiscuous and wild at heart, and find their true nature driving off into the sunset like some sort of a lone ranger. No, that's not how they were created. They were created and they find their greatest fulfillment rolling up their sleeves and getting deeply engaged with their families, with the social world, and with creative and productive work. So it's the opposite of the idea that men should escape. Men find their truest fulfillment in fulfilling their responsibilities, becoming the house father that they used to be called, recovering that vision.
And the secret to that, like you said at the beginning of what you just said, which is so beautiful, is the harmony between the sexes. God gave the mandate of be fruitful, multiply, and subdue the earth to a couple, to a man and a woman, and it's through their harmonization and bringing life into the world and their collaboration in building those social institutions, in subduing the earth, using the natural resources, that makes the entire civilization that we want to build, a beautiful civilization. So it's the family and the marriage, a man and a woman doing this project together, that makes the whole thing possible.
Yes, and the other side of it is I've been embroiled in a Twitter debate. My book.
Those are fun.
This book has proved to be more controversial than anyone I've ever written, which was kind of a surprise, because Love Thy Body, I thought, would be more controversial. It deals with issues like abortion and euthanasia, homosexuality, transgenderism, which is really cutting edge today. But this one has been more controversial. I'll give you some background that's not in the book. So I taught the manuscript in my classes. I led several reading groups to get lots of feedback, right? To find any rough edges. And when they would tell their family and friends that we were going through a book on masculinity, invariably, the first question was, whose side is she on? With that tone, whose side is she on? Men tended to assume I was probably some male-bashing feminist. Progressives tended to assume I was some angry, defensive reactionary. So I had to rewrite that first chapter many times to sort of overcome that initial hostility. And so back to your question. Yes, on Twitter right now, I was first attacked by more progressives. Now I'm being attacked by more conservatives who basically say I'm not giving adequate account of women's need to be domestic and in the home. And I'm like, wait a minute, I had a home birth. I did homeschooling. I work from home. I'm very focused on the home. So both sides, women and men were both called to create families and subdue the earth. They were both called to have the kind of integration of life and work that they did enjoy through most of human history. Many people think, well, let's get back to the traditional family, and they think to the 1950s. No, the traditional family is pre-industrial revolution.
Right.
Right. All through human history until that time, men and women worked from the home. All businesses, all economic enterprises were within the home. So both men and women were able to do economically productive work while raising their children. And so that balance is what I would like to see us try to recover today.
I think you could write a book, this is a little controversial, but The Feminist War on Femininity, or there could be a companion piece to this, because I understand, some hardcore, traditionalists, let's call them, saying, well, what about the women's role? You're saying men, belong in the home too. Well, what about women? Because there is so much narrative today, ideology today, pushing women out of the home, the boss babe culture, the women empowerment world of not just get out of the home, but kill your baby in order to succeed, right? That's the whole pro-abortion rhetoric, is you need this choice to be empowered, and the choice is to kill another human being, your own child. What do you think? Do you think that feminism is at fault in part for at least the toxic war on masculinity? And do you think it's also responsible for some of the toxic war on femininity?
Yes, in my book, I quote some of the early feminists like Betty Friedan, who said point blank that the married woman is a millstone around her husband's neck, that she's a leech and a parasite, because the woman at that time was not doing any economically productive work.
Well, she was not one of the first feminists, though. She was a 40s, 50s feminist.
Exactly. So, the early feminists were mostly against abortion, so it's important to keep that in mind. But Betty Friedan, Simone de Beauvoir, and others of that era often, back up. When the Industrial Revolution took men's work out of the home, it also took women's work out of the home. That's the thing we need to understand, because women did economically productive work. Household manufacture was the only kind of manufacture before the Industrial Revolution. So women were baking bread from scratch, doing all their cooking from scratch, making candles, making all their clothes from scratch. Women had a lot to do in terms of economically productive work and in terms of household manufacture. That was taken away from women. So I think that is really why the feminist movement started, because women said, well, wait a minute. To put it in biblical terms, women were called to fulfill the whole cultural mandate too, not only to be fruitful and multiply, but also to subdue the earth. Women were supposed to be able to use their talents and skills in economically productive work, which they had until the Industrial Revolution. And because they no longer did real work, quote unquote, the feminists like Betty Friedan said, well, they're childlike, they're dependent, they're parasites. She even sympathized with men divorcing their wives, because after all, who would want this millstone around their neck? So certainly a lot of the feminist rhetoric.
And her Feminine Mystique book, it was all about the woman that is just bored to tears and has no meaning as a suburban housewife alone in her house. Her kids are off at school. Her husband's working. She has a laundry machine, a washing machine doing her washing work. She has a refrigerator taking care. She doesn't have to go, get the milk fresh from the cow. She has everything in the home, so she has no purpose anymore. I think that was kind of she talked about this terrible sickness that was harming all these suburban women. And so therefore they need to leave the shackles of family life and go into the workplace and do what the men were doing.
Yes, and I have some sympathy for that because women were created to fulfill the cultural mandate, both sides of it. But I think the answer is, of course, to bring work home again. And most women I know who have children do bring some kind of productive work home. I know many women who work from home in various ways, both pink-collar work and, but of course, knowledge work is especially easy to bring home. Consultants, IT consultants, writers, which is me, I've worked almost my entire life primarily from home. And so I do think it's valid to say, how can we help women get a better life-work balance by bringing work home while their children are young? But it's time to start asking how men can also bring their work home. During the pandemic, I'll give you just one story because sometimes that anecdote sort of crystallizes it. But one of my graduate students' husband was an IT professional, and he came home during the pandemic. And because he was home more, he was able to be more involved with their family's homeschooling. He decided he would be the one to make lunch every day. He could take his kids to soccer and choir practice. And he was picking up so much of the family responsibilities that his wife was able to start a part-time business. She was an opera singer. I had a student who was an opera singer, so she started a voice studio, and the whole family benefited from the added income. So I interviewed her husband, and he said, our life is so much more balanced now. I am never going back to 40 hours in a cubicle. And
Wow.
then the final kicker was, he said, the time that I used to spend commuting to work every morning, I now spend praying with my wife.
Beautiful.
So this is
Sounds
what
like
can
an
be
ideal.
done.
So,
And that's what I give lots of anecdotes because there's no general principle yet, but lots of stories of people who did that during the pandemic and then said, I'm keeping this, I'm closer to my kids now. I'm more integrated into my family. This is what I want for myself.
So do you think then feminism at large was a reaction to this dramatic shift in society post-industrial revolution where basically the home was broken apart for many? And there is this new kind of division or separation between the sexes. And so with feminism, people wanting the vote, people wanting independence, maybe having their own economic independence, it was because they were trying to sort of solidify some sort of equilibrium between what they saw as men now breaking apart from women because of economic reasons.
Yes, exactly. There's a huge split. A gulf was created between the private world and the public world. And, of course, men had no choice but to go into the public realm. But women were then cut off from many of the opportunities that they had when society was more integrated. I mentioned Martin Luther earlier. Well, his wife, Catherine, Kette is German for Kathy, Kette, was very involved in raising the children, of course. They had many children. She was very involved when her husband had theologians come in and have theological discussions. Remember, they didn't have journals very much back then, so most of the professional consulting was personally visiting each other. So theologians would come into their home and stay for a while, and she was a very active part of these theological discussions. She had been a nun, after all, so she was very well theologically educated. She also ran several home-based businesses. She ran a brewery. She produced beer. She ran orchards. She ran farms. She had crops. She had livestock. I mean, she was a Proverbs 31 woman. So before the Industrial Revolution, women were not cut off from the rest of society in the way that they were after the Industrial Revolution. And I do think that's a big part of feminism. Insofar as we want to say there were some real needs that feminists were responding to, I don't agree with their solutions, but there were some real needs that they were responding to, and that is that women, everybody left the home except women, right? Husbands, extended family. Women used to have help raising the kids with extended family and older siblings, and the maiden aunt, which was much more common back then. Not everybody felt they had to marry, so often they would live with a household. And suddenly women were cut off from all of that. Oh, and healthcare was often done at home. Education was done at home. And all of a sudden women had none of that. It was just early childcare and cleaning the house. So there was we have to recognize women lost a lot at the Industrial Revolution.
I think it's so powerful to know the history because it just answers so many of the questions about not just why we got to where we are with so much of the animosity between the sexes and extremes and even the rejection of femininity and masculinity. But it also just, I think, brings a lot of hope for there is a way to be fully man, fully woman, in harmony, but it takes an intentionality about how do we set up our lives. You mentioned the knowledge economy earlier, and that kind of gives you some hope because now people can kind of work from home more and sort of incorporate their work with their home life more, both men and women. How do you see economically the future looking for, especially American society, and for helping men sort of reclaim their house father role as women also reclaim their house mother role, which is also under attack?
Yes, well, sometimes people say the Industrial Revolution took work out of the home. The technological revolution is bringing it back, but making it possible to bring it back. And now I want to clarify that sometimes I get pushback by people saying, well, there's an important social component to work. Sometimes it's important for a person to be in the office. Fine, yes. I'm talking about when you have young children in the home. That's my concern. My concern is raising the kids. So I think that perhaps we should think in terms of work having stages. Like when your kids are young, you find ways to work at least part-time from home so that you can be more integrated into your family. And when your children are grown and gone, you have more options. I'm not saying that home-based work is the best for everybody. I'm saying it's the best for parents who are trying to be involved with their children. And I would like to see, by the way, I do quote a lot of CEOs during the pandemic who found that work from home did not bring down productivity. We've got to convince business as well that this is good for them. I quote a couple who said, here's what one CEO said. He said, we were afraid to let people work from home before the pandemic because we were afraid that productivity would decline. He said that fear was completely exploded. During the pandemic, when people worked from home, we saw no decrease in productivity. In fact, sometimes we saw increases because people who work from home are not wasting a lot of time commuting and unnecessary meetings and so on. So I read several articles by CEOs saying, actually, you have to be careful that people don't work too much when they work from home. They don't know when to stop. So it's a win-win for both sides, but we have to make the case to business and industry that they're actually going to benefit more. Here's how one CEO put it. She said, if you give parents the time to be better parents, they actually end up being better workers. They do, in fact, they're happier, they're more balanced, and they may not come in on Sundays, the weekends. They may not come in on the weekends as much. They might not do as much overtime, but their time on the job, they're more productive. So I put a lot of those quotes in the book so that you can bring that to your boss, and make a case for working at least part-time from home when your children are young.
I love that vision, and I think increasingly it's going to be possible. The key is helping persuade people, giving people the vision of what really harmony between the sexes can look like, marriage, the beauty of the marriage and the family project. And then, it's in no way anti-masculine to be very engaged in the home. And it's also, as a woman, you're going to find reward, not just doing some work and creative work, and maybe you're economically providing for the family as well, which is, common for many families today, but that the home too is just like for the man. And even more so when you're the mother of a young child is a beautifully rewarding place to be when it's done in proper community, right? Like you said earlier, if the woman is just all by herself with the baby, it can be incredibly alienating. I think that's one of the reasons postpartum depression rates are so high is you just leave a woman with a newborn with no support system. The man is off back at work. There's no sort of system to support her emotionally and physically. Yeah, that can be incredibly difficult. And I don't think it's natural. I know we don't have much more time, but I do want to ask you another question, maybe a little controversial, about, again, about masculinity. So men are obviously physically stronger than women. I think there's been studies done about men and women and their IQs. And my understanding is they're largely the same at large, although at the end of the bell curve, there are more male geniuses than women geniuses, but overall women are slightly smarter. Is that what your research shows?
Well, I did find one study that said that, but I wouldn't want to say that I would go with a single study. Although women do test out higher on test of emotional intelligence, that's not quite so surprising. But if I can, I wanted to pick up on one thing you said earlier when you said it is masculine to be involved with your family, because one of the things that's a bit unique about the book is people who try to encourage men to be more involved in their families usually take a scolding tone. Like, you need to spend more time at home. I have a graduate student who is the leader of a large women's ministry in a big Baptist church. And she said on Mother's Day, we hand out roses and tell the mothers they're wonderful. On Father's Day, we scold the men and tell them to do better. And so one of the things that was so unique about the book, I was surprised to find this, there's a lot of data showing that men benefit from becoming involved fathers. I'm not averse to appealing to people's self-interest. So fathers themselves are reporting that that becoming a father enhances their sense of manhood. And it's even biochemical. We already knew that when a woman gives birth, her oxytocin rises, right, which is a bonding hormone, which gives her a little bit of a biochemical boost in attaching to her infant. Well, it turns out that men's oxytocin goes up too when their baby is born, and the baby's oxytocin goes up when the father is. The father has to be actively holding, playing with, cuddling his baby. It's stimulated by tactile sense. So, but when the father is holding and playing with his child, his oxytocin goes up as well. His testosterone goes down, by the way, so he's a bit gentler, and his oxytocin goes up. And so men, too, are biochemically primed to be committed, attached, nurturing fathers. And the biggest surprise, this was the most recent data, it was by an anthropologist, and she discovered that men's oxytocin is actually rising all through his wife's pregnancy. So for the 9 months of his wife's pregnancy, if they're living together, his oxytocin is going up at the same time hers is. Nobody knew that. Incredible. I guess nobody thought to test a man's blood during his wife's pregnancy. But when they did, they found out that all those 9 months, he is also being biochemically primed to be fully involved as a father. So fathers do, and there's even something called, psychologists call it the dad brain. In other words, there's a nest of neurons that fire when a man becomes a father, that don't fire if you don't become a father, or if you're not an engaged father. So there's a psychologist who says, when a man becomes a father, he is actually, his brain activity actually increases. So men actually benefit greatly from becoming fathers. And so, we can help them realize that they themselves will experience a deeper sense of purpose, meaning, and just fulfillment of when they become fathers, so that we can appeal to them in a positive way and not just sort of a scolding tone, which I think is more common.
I think it's a great point, and I love what you shared. I think people don't usually get to hear that, and it's important to hear about the beautiful benefits of fatherhood for men. Where I was going with the last question about, IQ or just physical differences between women, and the IQ was more of a little, almost like a joke. It's another popular Twitter battle between, some on the left and the right and the red pill and that whole world. But really, these biological differences between men and women, the fact that only women can be mothers, only men can be fathers, men are physically at large stronger, women alone can nurture, we gestate, we can lactate, we do these things. What do you think, this kind of harkens back to your book, Live Thy Body. What are the lessons, the moral lessons about the differences between the sexes?
Yes, so of course, one of the first questions I always got when I was writing the book was, and so what do you think are the differences between men and women? And so that had to go into chapter 1, right at the beginning, because everyone's going to ask it. And you're right. Let's start with just biology. Well, psychologically, let me say this. Psychologically, men and women, of course, are more similar than they are different. And so if you take even a trait like aggression, surprisingly, you get a bell curve for women and you get a bell curve for men, and they overlap extremely closely. They differ mostly at the edges, at the extremes, which is why 90% of prison inmates are male. They're at that extreme of aggression. So it is important to always remember we are more alike than different. You know, when Eve shows up in the Garden of Eden, Adam doesn't say, "Oh, somebody who's kind of different from me." No, he says, "Bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh." You know, he's excited because it's somebody who's like him. So we want to keep that in mind even when we discuss differences. But let's go to biology. Obviously, men are bigger, stronger, faster. Because of testosterone, they tend to be more aggressive and risk-taking. And it is time for us to just say, these are good things. This is how God made men. And we should be grateful for these differences, for the uniquenesses of the sexes. Instead of denigrating them, you do see feminists, you've probably seen this. You have seen feminists who'll say, well, women could be just as strong as men if they would just work out. Well, no, they won't be. And it's time for us to say these are good things. Now, let me give you another study, though. The thing is, of course, what we do have to help men recognize is that their greater strength was not given them to get what they want. It was given them to provide, protect, and cherish those who they love. So there was an anthropologist who did the first ever cross-cultural concepts of masculinity. And what he found was, no matter how they define masculinity, which does differ some from culture to culture, what they all agreed on was what he called the 3 Ps. That to be a man means you provide, you protect, and you procreate, meaning have a family, build into the next generation. He found that this was universal. And my takeaway is, men are made in God's image, and they do know that their strength was not given them to just overpower others, dominate others, control, get what they want. It was given them to provide, protect, and be a good father. And it seems to be built into the male nature because this was cross-cultural. This was around the globe. These weren't Christian cultures that he was investigating. Many they were non-Christian as well. I mean, people who didn't have a biblical background had that innate, inherent knowledge of what it means to be a good man. They had a knowledge of that their strengths were given them for a purpose, and that they would be most fulfilled when they live out that purpose. It seems to be a universal understanding that men have. That just, like I said, it's an innate knowledge.
How can we celebrate and encourage, foster healthy masculinity, especially in boys and young men?
I think I'll give you one more study because this was another one I put at the front of the book because, like I said, people were asking, what side is she on? Whose side is she on? And so I put this right at the beginning because it tended to diffuse that hostility. It's a sociologist. He's not a Christian himself, but he's well known in his field, and so he speaks all around the world. So once again, we're getting a global perspective. And so he came up with this clever experiment. He asked young men 2 questions. First, he would ask them, what does it mean to be a good man? If you are at a funeral, in the eulogy, somebody says, he was a good man. What does that mean? And the sociologist said all around the world, young men had no problem answering that. They would jump right in with duty, honor, integrity, sacrifice, do the right thing, look out for the little guy, be a protector, be a provider, be responsible. You get the picture. And so the sociologist would ask them, well, where'd you learn that? And they'd say, it's just in the air we breathe. Yeah. Or if they were in a Western country, they would say, it's part of our Judeo-Christian heritage. And then he would follow up with a second question. He'd say, well, what does it mean if I say to you, man up, be a real man? And the young men would say, oh, no, that's completely different. That means be tough, be strong, never show weakness, win at all costs, be competitive, get rich, get laid. I'm using their language. And the sociologist concluded that men really have these 2 competing scripts, and this is all around the world. On the one hand, again, men innately know what it means to be the good man. It's an inherent knowledge that all men have. But they feel cultural pressure to live up to the standard of the real man, so to speak, which does include the more toxic behaviors, especially if it's decoupled from a moral vision of what it means to be a man. It can easily slide into dominance and control and entitlement and so on. And so I think this gives us a better way to deal with this issue, because when we talk to men, well, they don't respond very well to being accused of being toxic, right? Nobody would. So a better strategy is to see if we can tap into their innate knowledge of what it means to be the good man. Can we affirm and encourage and support men in their innate knowledge of and their innate aspiration? I think they aspire to be the good man. Most men do, in fact, aspire to be that. Can we support them in that aspiration? And that gives us a much more positive way to deal with these issues.
I love that vision. And I think that there's, I would argue, millions of people, parents, already doing that with their sons. And I really hope, Nancy, you'll consider a book on femininity next. Do you think that might be in the cards?
Well, yes, I did deal with it a little bit here, just because you have to, right? You have, if you're going to talk about men, you have to talk about women. So I did deal a little bit with the things we talked about, how the Industrial Revolution affected women, and how it did give rise to the feminist movement. But you're right; it needs a much fuller answer.
I had a draft manuscript, more of an outline with a few chapters from almost a decade ago called Woman at War, the War on Femininity. And I'm looking for, I don't know that I'm the person to complete that kind of a book, but after reading some of your books, I think you do a phenomenal job of it, because that story, I think, needs to be told as much as the man's story, because today, as women are seen more as the victim and men as the villain, women to be empowered is to be pro-abortion, and all of this nonsense really about women, the infantilization of women on the one hand, with the sort of reckless autonomy with no regard for anyone else on the other. It's a toxic femininity that exists and needs to be combated as much. So anyways, I'm so grateful for your work. It's been really powerful. I know you've got a lot of work in front of you. And how can people find you and get your book, The Toxic War on Masculinity?
Yeah, so the book is available at all the normal places. Go to Amazon, or if you prefer other places like christianbook.com, or if you're lucky you have a brick and mortar store. But you can also come to my website. My publisher redid my website, very colorful. So come on over, nancypearcey.com. And Pearcey is Pearcey. So nancypearcey.com, you can browse my other books. And by the way, I should say Total Truth, one of my earlier books, also has a chapter on women and the Industrial Revolution and women, a little bit fuller than what I give in this book. Chapter 12. So look, Total Truth, chapter 12 talks about women. But you can browse my other books. You can leave a comment. I do read the comments. So come on by my website. It'd be fun to talk with you.
Thank you so much, Nancy. It's been awesome talking with you, and thank you for all your work.
Thank you for all your work. I really appreciate your work with live action and everything that you do. So it was good talking with you.
Hey guys, thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Lila Rose podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave us a review. The review helps the podcast reach more people. Give us 5 stars. And also, don't forget, we have launched a Patreon. Now, by becoming a monthly subscriber of any amount that you can give, you can get access to a monthly live that I will be doing with our Patreon members. So we're launching this next month. Become a member now so you can get in on this. And you can also just be part of this community that we're going to be growing, which will have special updates about the show, upcoming guests. You can submit questions, and we'll be sure to include those on the show in the future. So check out Patreon. It's at the link in the bio, and you can become a member of it for any amount. And we'd love to have you join the community that is helping the Lila Rose podcast grow.